In a sealed glass case at the shrine of the book in Jerusalem, a fragment of parchment contains 6 lines of Aramaic describing a place beneath the earth with 4 separate chambers, 4 separate populations, and 4 completely different conditions. The Book of Enoch was removed from the biblical canon at the Council of Laodicea in 364 CE. Church leaders called it unsuitable for the faithful. For 17 centuries, it disappeared almost entirely from Western Christianity. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of the Book of Enoch surfaced. More copies than were found of most books that remained in the Bible. The fragments are real, authenticated, and held in major scholarly collections. What chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch describes is not a single place of fire and punishment. It describes a structured system, 4 chambers, each holding a different category of person, each operating under different conditions. And the categories the text uses for who goes where are different from what most Western Christians have been taught. This documentary examines what the text actually says, who the scholars are who have studied it, what the manuscript record establishes, and where the line sits between what the text genuinely contains and what various researchers have proposed it means. This documentary does not tell viewers what to believe about the afterlife. It examines an ancient text and the scholarly discussion around it, framed as educational exploration. Nothing more. Before we go further, subscribe now if this kind of textual and historical exploration is what you are here for. Every week, this channel examines ancient texts, scholarly debates, and interpretive questions that mainstream discourse sometimes leaves at the edge. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The manuscript record. What is verified fragment 4Q206 at the Israel Museum Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem contains Aramaic text from chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch. It is dated by scholars to approximately 100 BCE, older than every book of the New Testament. This is documented and not in dispute. The complete version of chapter 22 exists in the Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, including manuscripts held at Axum. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has continuously maintained Enoch in its biblical canon for well over a millennium. This is documented. George Nicholsburg, whose 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch for Fortress Press is a standard scholarly reference, did characterize chapter 22 as the most structurally detailed description of the afterlife in any Second Temple Jewish text. This is documented in his published work. James Vanderkam of the University of Notre Dame has published extensively on Dead Sea Scrolls and Enoch literature. His observation that Enoch's afterlife framework was likely familiar to early Christians, given its place in Second Temple Jewish tradition, is consistent with what mainstream Enoch scholarship documents about the text's historical significance. Lorenz Stuckenbruck of Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich has published detailed work on the Aramaic Enoch tradition, including the broader Qumran Enoch corpus. His scholarly output is documented and peer-reviewed. These are all real scholars. Their published work is the foundation of this documentary's engagement with the text, and it is important to distinguish throughout between what those scholars actually argued and what alternative researchers have proposed their work implies. What chapter 22 actually says, the text begins with Enoch being taken by the angel Raphael to a location he describes as vast, dark, and divided. Not one space, 4 separate hollows, each sealed from the others. The Ge'ez manuscript uses a word for hollow that, as Ethiopic scholars have noted, carries connotations of a container built to hold something specific and sealed to prevent mixing. This is what the text describes for each chamber, understood throughout as the content of an ancient literary and religious text whose interpretation is actively debated. The first chamber contains what the text calls the spirits of the righteous, not the perfect, not the canonized, but people who lived ordinary, decent lives. They are described as being in a state of rest near a spring of bright water. The text specifies, importantly, that the righteous dead are not yet in their final destination. They are in a holding state, preserved in comfort until a judgment that has not yet occurred. Nicolsburg's scholarly commentary on this passage notes that the first chamber reflects a Second Temple Jewish understanding of the afterlife as an interim state rather than a final destination, a concept that is genuinely attested across Second Temple Jewish literature and that differs from the simplified heaven-at-death framework that became dominant in Western Christianity. This observation is within mainstream scholarship. The second chamber contains the spirits of people who died as victims of violence, people killed without justice, whose deaths were never officially acknowledged or their killers never punished. The text says these spirits are not at rest. The Ge'ez uses a verb describing continuous sound, not screaming or weeping, but something closer to the sound of flowing water that cannot stop. The text is specific about what they are crying for, not vengeance, but acknowledgement, for their cases to be formally heard and their deaths entered into a divine accounting. The text states this continuous cry does not resolve until judgment. Scholars reading this passage note that it reflects ancient Jewish concepts of divine justice that operated on a cosmic accounting model. The idea that deaths which went unanswered before God were an unresolved claim demanding resolution. This concept is attested in other Second Temple Jewish literature, including Psalms and portions of later apocalyptic writing. The third chamber contains sinners, but specifically, sinners who received their punishment during their lifetime, who suffered consequences for their actions before they died. These spirits are described as dim, not in agony, not in active punishment, but set apart in a condition that implies the account is settled while the record remains. One detail noted in the Ge'ez manuscript is that the spirits in this chamber are described as isolated, each one separate, not grouped together. The text uses language suggesting scattered presence rather than communal existence. The debt was paid, the account closed. But closing a debt does not restore what the debt damaged. The fourth chamber is the one the text describes as permanent. It contains a specific category, not sinners in general, not liars or thieves as a class, but people who sinned, were not punished in life, and who actively sustained the wrongdoing of others. People whose actions enabled harm to continue after it would otherwise have stopped. Their condition involves active suffering described as heat, without visible flame. The text uses language for permanence, the same language used elsewhere for the permanence of mountains, without an announced end. What mainstream scholarship says about chapter 22. It is important to be precise about what scholars have and have not concluded from this text. Nicolsburg's characterization of chapter 22 as highly structured is documented. His scholarly reading places the four-chamber framework within the context of Second Temple Jewish diversity of belief about the afterlife, a period during which, as mainstream scholarship documents, Jewish communities held a range of views about what happened after death, none of which were yet canonically standardized. Chapter 22 represents one developed articulation of that diversity. What Nicolsburg did not conclude, and what no peer-reviewed Enoch scholarship has concluded, that the four-chamber framework is a literal physical map of an actual underworld. Mainstream scholarship reads chapter 22 as a sophisticated ancient theological and ethical reflection presented in narrative form. Significant, unusually specific, and worthy of serious attention, but not a literal architectural diagram. The claim in some alternative research accounts that the fourth chamber's criterion, those who sustained wickedness in others, was specifically suppressed because it implicated institutional church structures, is a proposed interpretive reading. It is not a mainstream scholarly conclusion. The Council of Laodicea's exclusion of Enoch involved many texts and many considerations. That the four-chamber framework was theologically inconvenient for a developing institutional church is a plausible argument some scholars find compelling. That the exclusion was specifically motivated by the fourth chamber's criterion about enabling wickedness is a stronger claim than the historical evidence clearly establishes. The account of a 2018 Hebrew University team being granted access to only 2 of 4 requested fragments, with the other 2 listed as undergoing conservation, is presented in the original script as a suppression narrative. It is worth noting that conservation and restricted access to fragile ancient documents is standard practice in major collections, applied broadly and not selectively to theologically inconvenient content. Without specific documentation that the access restriction was motivated by content concerns rather than conservation priorities, this account should be held as an unverified suppression claim rather than confirmed evidence of targeted restriction. The near-death research: accurate, real, and separate. The original script references research by Dr. Sam Parnia at NYU Langone Medical Center and a 2022 study published in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Parnia's research on experiences reported during cardiac arrest is real and published in peer-reviewed medical literature. His 2014 study in resuscitation is a documented publication. The 2022 AWARE-2 study published in Resuscitation, not in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences as stated in the original, is also real and documented. What this research documents: some patients who experienced cardiac arrest report structured experiences during the period of clinical death, including awareness and experiences of review. This is a genuine, peer-reviewed finding that is studied within medicine and psychology. What this research does not establish: any connection to the Book of Enoch. Parnia's research does not reference Enoch. It was not designed to test ancient textual claims. The proposed correspondence between Parnia's research findings and the structure of Enoch's 4 chambers is a comparison drawn by alternative researchers, not a finding from within near-death research or biblical studies. The correspondence is rhetorically interesting. It is not scientific corroboration of the ancient text, the suppression history. What is documented the Council of Laodicea's 364 CE exclusion of Enoch is documented historical fact. Jerome's exclusion of Enoch from the Vulgate and his preface comments about it are documented. Augustine's discussion of detailed afterlife accounts in the City of God is documented. What Jerome and Augustine actually argued, as opposed to what alternative researchers propose they were suppressing, involves a range of theological and canonical concerns that mainstream historians of early Christianity have documented. Jerome's concern about the text's authority and authorship, Augustine's concern about speculation about the afterlife, and the broader canonical standardization process of the 4th century involved considerations beyond any single chapter's criteria. The claim that Jerome and Augustine read the 4th chamber criterion and found it institutionally threatening is a proposed motive, not a documented one. Neither of their surviving writings makes this argument explicit. It is an inference from their exclusion decisions, a plausible inference that some historians find worth exploring, but an inference nonetheless. What is established and what is not? What can be independently verified? 4Q206 is a real fragment at the shrine of the book. The Ethiopian Ge'ez Enoch manuscripts are real. Nickelsburg, Vanderkam, Nib, and Stuckenbrook are real scholars with verifiable published work. Chapter 22 of Enoch genuinely describes 4 chambers with 4 different conditions and 4 different populations, as Nickelsburg documented. The Council of Laodicea's exclusion of Enoch is documented. Parnia's near-death research is real and published. What has not been independently verified: the specific 2018 fragment access restriction account and its implied suppression motivation. The claim that the 4th chamber's criterion was the specific theological problem motivating canonical exclusion. The exact private correspondence and archival details attributed to specific scholars in the original script. What mainstream scholarship establishes, Chapter 22, is an unusually detailed and structured afterlife description within Second Temple Jewish literature. Its 4-chamber framework differs significantly from the simplified heaven-hell binary that became dominant in Western Christianity. Its exclusion from the Western canon was part of a broader 4th century canonical standardization process with multiple documented motivations. What is worth holding on to, Chapter 22 of the Book of Enoch, is a genuine, authenticated, significantly understudied ancient text that describes an afterlife framework meaningfully different from what most Western Christians have encountered in church teaching. That difference is worth knowing, not because it proves any particular claim about what actually happens after death, but because it illuminates the genuine diversity of BTA Ayres Okersent Dot. The text is available. Nickelsburg's 2001 commentary, Nib's 1978 Oxford translation, and Isaac's 1983 Ge'ez translation are all published and accessible. The fragment 4Q206 is held in Jerusalem. Anyone interested in this material can engage with it through the genuine scholarly literature that exists around it. Whether the four chambers Enoch describes reflect a genuine theological tradition that was marginalized, a sophisticated ancient ethical reflection that was inconvenient for institutional religion, or something else entirely. That is a question the available evidence raises without fully settling. The text says what it says. The question of what it means, and why it was removed, is genuinely open.